Miguel, Mike, you ready?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today for our latest Index on Air webinar. Our session today is focused on crisis communication. And I know we've all experienced for the past couple of months, a pretty unprecedented time when we're subject to and we're having to share pretty tough communication, both externally and internally. So today we invited two communication industry leaders, Mike Nelson and Miguel Head, to join us as we explore best practices for most effective communication techniques during challenging time. So just a quick introduction for Mike and Miguel, and then we'll get started. And just a quick logistical note, we're gonna have about 30 minutes of moderated Q&A, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And the best way we learn that we could do that is if you can submit your questions through the Q&A option on Zoom, then in the last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll get to them. But please feel free to submit questions throughout the whole session. So kind of going back to our two panelists today. So Mike Nelson was at Google for 15 years, where he was most recently VP of Global Communications, and he managed both corporate and product communications. While at Google, he also managed and led communications and public affairs for Asia Pacific. And actually, Mike and I met in Japan, in Tokyo, about a few years ago when I was at Dropbox, and we were opening our first office. And not only was he kind enough to kind of show me the ropes and give me advice on how to set that up, but he also invited me to a delicious Google lunch. I'll never forget it. He was overlooking the whole city. And we've stayed in touch ever since. And I'm super excited to have him here today. I don't think there's anything he hasn't seen in his 15-year career at Google. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, glad to be here.
Miguel Head is currently a director at Milltown Partners, which is a leading global communication agency. And he's advising executive and companies on how to effectively communicate as leaders. Before that, he was a little bit of a celebrity. He was part of the British royal household, where he was chief of staff to the young generation of the royal family, I think William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan, for 6 years. And before that, he worked as the young prince's first head of communication for 4 years. So I'm pretty sure nobody gets more media coverage than the royal family, even though Google is trying to really hard to give it a run for its money. So I'm super excited to have both of you today. So
lovely to be here. Thank you.
So just to get started, Mike, I would love for you to take this first question. But as I mentioned before, we're finding ourselves in a pretty unprecedented situation, and a lot of companies in this environment are doing either extremely well or unfortunately not so well. So on either side, if you really think about it, leaders are facing a communication crisis. So how do you balance communicating good news in today's environment, and how do you handle negative news?
It's well, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's I was at Google for 15 years, and it was a smaller company when I joined, and it's a large company when I left. And I think it's all really the same. There's a baseline. You know, in any of these, facts matter, speed matters, consistency matters. But I think right now, more than anything, tone matters. Getting it right. I mean, you can't open a web page and not have some data visualization or some fact around going, what's happening. We're awash in facts, and that's all good. But I think what's really cutting through is the tone. And the tone for Google, at least, has been consistent in the 15 years that I was there. I was hired by a guy named David Crane. He now owns Google Ventures, and he invested heavily in the Google voice to be very humble, to be very human. And it's harder than it sounds in order to strip out a lot of the techno-Latin that we use on a day-to-day basis and to communicate in a very, very human way. So I would say that now's as good a time as any for any company of any size to invest in that tone and to be human in the language that they use and the way that they communicate. And I think that that cuts through a lot of the other things that we're hearing around facts and figures and whatnot.
Great, thanks so much for that. Miguel, what's your perspective on this topic?
I mean, I agree with everything Mike has just said. And I think, I mean, those CEOs who have been seen to be very successful in the last few weeks, and we are just talking about a few weeks now, that's what's so extraordinary about this. are the ones who have engaged in a really empathetic and human way with their staff and with their customers and their suppliers, and shown vulnerability, shown that they don't have all the answers. And I think what's interesting now, what the great challenge is now for CEOs, is how they pivot to something that approaches business as usual. And we can see the beginnings of that now, and perhaps I can talk about that later. But that's a really hard judgment call. And I think at this time, what CEOs who are successful are doing are falling back on their core values. You know, what does their company actually stand for? What mission does it have in the world? And if they can stick to those principles and those values during this crisis and not let go of them at any cost, just to pursue growth at any cost, then they're more likely to come out of it stronger. But it's a huge challenge that CEOs have at this time to make that pivot. So
to me, this environment has been really fascinating, because everybody is unfortunately facing so much crisis, and in a normal environment, and you both kind of picked up on in your answers on this, on like bringing out the human aspect, or not forgetting our humanity. And in a normal environment, I feel like the scrutiny and coverage are pretty high, both externally and internally. Do you think right now we find ourselves in a more understanding environment, both from a media perspective, but also from an employee perspective? And Miguel, maybe you can take this one first.
Well, I don't know if it's more understanding. I think the scrutiny is there, and it's going to remain there. I think one of the things that companies, particularly bigger companies, need to be watching out at the moment is that they are above reproach when it comes to coming out of this crisis. You know, companies large and small have taken huge sums of taxpayer-backed money, you know, both in the United States here and in Great Britain and elsewhere. And that means that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on how they spent that, executive pay, taxes, and so on. I think one thing that is helping companies is because this crisis is happening to everybody all at the same time. It means that companies can watch one another and learn from one another and share best practice. I've really been struck actually by the amount of CEOs who have asked for help on social media, who've asked other people for advice on how to you know, pursue certain types of kind of problems that they're facing that are not unique to them. For example, you know, how best to set up workers working from home, how best to help workers in factories and workshops, and so on. And that form of collaboration, I think, is probably helping companies. But otherwise, I think the scrutiny is going to be very tough.
Mike, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, you know, I think that asking for help, I think Miguel touched on something that's really important. And that help is not only external, sometimes it's internal. I remember it's been a few years now, but around 2008, Google laid off 200 people. And it was a tough moment inside of the company. And at the time, the CFO was Patrick Pichette. And Patrick opened it up to the company, and he said, what are ways that we can start to cut costs? How can we trim some of the expenses? And he open sourced it to the entire company on ways. And there was a meme going around about being scrappy and whatnot that he got tagged with. But by asking for help among the people who were affected most, I think that it engendered a lot of trust and made what was a difficult moment a lot easier.
You know, just a small parenthesis, because this was something so fascinating to me. I've never seen a company that did what Google did at the time, but I remember that was a really tough time for you guys, because I remember there was a Fortune covers story that came out with like the melting letters of Google, and pretty much everybody was kind of rooting for Google to not do so well. So curious, how did you guys get out of that situation? I mean, you've done obviously a tremendous job, but any specific strategies that you've employed during that time?
Yeah, and I think that it was one of the reasons I stayed at Google for as long as I did, because I believe deeply in the products. And when I came back from Tokyo, which was just a fabulous experience, I came back for product communications, and focusing on the products at that time And around 2008, yeah, in that window, there was, we launched a Me Too product in a crowded category that no one thought there was any need for. That was Chrome. We had bought a small acquisition for a company that really no one really saw any need for, and that was Android. We also bought a company that was under an awful lot of litigation around copyright infringement and spent more than $1 billion for it, and that was YouTube. And those are three of the biggest and best platforms at Google that it took a lot of effort to get to, but that focus on what are the products that we're delivering to customers and how can we improve that customer experience is really, really cutting through. And I'm seeing that in some companies right now, focusing on that experience. So I think sticking to that discipline around it, and that doesn't contradict the need for tone. I think they work hand in glove together.
So coming back to today's environment, I think it would be really interesting to hear from both of you your perspective in terms of who do you think is handling the current situation in a good way. And it could be either example of like not private company, but like companies or also governments or politicians. I don't know which one of you would like to go first. Maybe Mike, you can take first. Or Miguel, go for it.
Miguel, why don't you go first?
Because both our names start with M, I thought you were about to say me. I'll just jump in first, just because one thing that I've really enjoyed watching over the last few weeks is the coverage that's being given to female leaders, political leaders around the world, prime ministers of New Zealand, Denmark, Germany, Iceland, Sweden, and so on. And particularly what I think people are calling those leaders out for is that they've managed to do something which we can all see is really, really tough to do, which is, how to be straightforward, how to be kind of deliver some really difficult messages, but at the same time, how to be compassionate. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is that those of us who have been in this business for a long time and advise leaders about, how to get through crisis, often advise leaders, you don't have to think you have all the answers. You don't have to be the quote unquote strong man. And this crisis actually has illustrated why that is really important, that being collaborative, not pretending you have all the answers and, deferring to others who are experts. I mean, all of those traits that, we long advocate, but are often easily forgotten in normal business, suddenly come to the fore now. And I'm kind of really pleased to see that. I'm just going to say one other thing, which is, I live in California now, but I watched the Queen Elizabeth's message to the nation. When I was going to bring that up, I have to say, it kind of, I thought it was, so first thing, it was only the 4th time the Queen has spoken to the nation in that way in her 67-year reign, which is just extraordinary if you think about it. And the second thing is, what she did was, and actually Mike touched on this earlier when he was talking about Google, what she did was she went back to core principles. What are the royal family as an institution all about? And it's about timeless values. It's about standing up for values that mattered 10 years ago, matter now, and will matter in 10 years' time, around duty and service and looking out for one another. And she delivered that message, beautifully. I'm not just obliged to say that. Actually, I really thought that. And I thought it was one of the best examples of leadership that, in terms of a message to the nation, that there has actually been in this crisis anywhere in the world. And testament to the way that she has always just stuck to her guns, that she always sticks to what's important.
I feel like I could have like endless conversation about the Queen, but in the interest of time, Mike, do you want to share with us who have you been maybe inspired?
Well, first, I really appreciate Miguel's attributes of self-discipline and his quiet, good-natured resolve. It's funny, the Queen, my oldest daughter, her boyfriend is from England, and he couldn't get back to England and come back. So anyway, I'm conducting online schooling for him too. And he had watched the Queen a number of times, and he's this really quiet kid. And I was like, what is it about? So anyway, I watched it. I completely agree with you. It was really good. Maybe a company that it's controversial. I think it serves as a pretty good exemplar is Zoom, because we're on the Zoom call. I'm looking at Zoom webinar. There was never a Zoom call in my house. And then one day I went to about 20 of them a day. You know, Santa Clara University, UCLA, high school in San Francisco. My wife does yoga. I mean, our whole house was Zoom. And a lot of the media attention and scrutiny went with it. And they had a number of difficulties. I remember when I first came to the Valley, there was this phrase, inside the tornado. It's when companies cross this chasm and became really popular. I've never seen a company hit the chasm like that, ever. And so they had the Zoom bombing, and then the iOS app was sharing, and then they had encryption, and then they misrepresented participants versus users, and it kind of went on and on. But they stayed with it. I don't want to say they're ahead of it, but Eric, and I don't know him, the CEO, made it personal. He got ahead of it. He didn't ask me anything. He had a 90-day plan. I just saw he bought an encryption company yesterday or today in the news to help that. He's had this deliberate cadence of communications and hadn't tried to duck it. And I think that it's impressive. And it's somewhat controversial right now. And it has a number of competitors. Google has a competitive product to it, but I thought he did a really, really good job.
Yeah, I noticed Google has inserted Google Meetings now in my Gmail account. It's pushing my chat down below, so it's harder to chat.
It's not insert, it's an option. They're giving you the option to
Once Google, always Google, Mike.
I mean, I also find Zoom completely fascinating, and I do have to appreciate the quality of the technology on a daily basis. I think when I'm like left out of my cage, I'm gonna have to have Zoom with me, because I'm associating conversations with Zoom so much right now. I really have to look at myself when I speak.
Yeah, and it did, you know, like so many of the companies, and Google did this, right? Consumer products into business. Zoom went from a business product into consumer. And I think a lot of those speed bumps that they hit, they hadn't anticipated, or they certainly didn't anticipate that those bumps would be as high. And it didn't stop them. They didn't turn around. They kept going and improving. And it takes a lot of courage and determination. I imagine that they're exhausted. I don't know anyone who works there, but I imagine it's pretty hard.
Kind of wanted to switch gears for a second, because we have a lot of comms leaders on the call. So given today's environment and also your experience, how do you think the leaders should be approaching this unprecedented time? And do you think it's going to have a long-term impact on what the role of the communication leader is going to be within the company? And you can take
Miguel,
yeah, I'll go. I mean, it's a kind of a really tough one. That, I mean, when I worked in-house in communications, I worked in an environment where we worked alongside kind of the equivalent of the policy chiefs and the lawyers very, very closely. And in those jobs, you become a kind of, in some respects, a kind of minor league lawyer yourself. You kind of understand the law, you understand how lawyers think. You can kind of second guess them if sometimes in order to be able to kind of out-argue them when you're trying to kind of advocate a particular course of action, particularly over apologies, for example. But the one thing that I think will probably change is that internal communications in businesses has always been the kind of poor relation. It's often left to HR professionals to communicate to, sometimes vast global organizations when those HR professionals aren't always, as up to speed on communications channels and methods and audiences and so on that the kind of communications departments are. And I think one of the things that will need to change is that comms people become much closer to HR people, kind of understand their business better and vice versa. I mean, I've been kind of monitoring a lot of kind of CEO activity over the last few weeks. And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of CEOs use kind of external communications, LinkedIn, Facebook profiles, Reddits, whatever it is, actually primarily, especially at the moment, for internal communications matters. What they're saying really applies more internally than it applies externally. And that's been a huge learning curve, I imagine, for a lot of communications professionals right now. So I think that will be the big thing that changes over time.
I agree with most, if not all, but of what Miguel said. But I do believe that, internal is the new external communications. When I was at Google and I left in January, I thought that it was harder to find really good internal communications people than it was external communications people in the Valley. And there are a lot of really, really talented people out there. But one of the things my dad used to say is, you have, Michael, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that proportion. And I think that that's pretty good advice for companies right now. A lot of what happened inside of Google very quickly happened outside of Google. Often it happened inside and outside. There is no just internal communications anymore. There's communications, and I think that that's okay, right? The internet broke down boundaries of businesses and global, and why not break down that internal external silo? Now, there are certainly secrets that confidential information that should be confidential and needs to be confidential. But I think the point that I might depart just a little bit is within HR. I think being a really good partner for HR is important, but there's a certain level of empathy and listening that takes place in internal comms that is a bit different than, here's how we're going to do perf, here's how we're going to do salary adjustments, this is what the equity awards are, et cetera. And it's almost like you had asked originally how I think it's going to morph, and I don't know, but at the end of the year, David Brooks of the New York Times wrote a piece on how media is failing. And he said, it's not why you think. And it was about media just reporting facts and not reporting on understanding or the causes behind things. And it got me thinking that the same is true in communications, that it's not just the facts, it's why are people feeling what they're feeling. My friend Lily Lynn, who took over a lot of what I did at Google, I caught up with this week, and she says, I try to meet people where they are. Whether they're really young and they're feeling isolated, or whether they have young kids and they're trying to run school, every day I talk to someone, I try to meet them where they are. And I thought something like that, there's this empathy and understanding that is now implicit in the role, more than just being a good writer or understanding issues or that kind of thing. So I think it is morphing. I'd be curious to see how it continues to morph.
These are both really great insights. Thank you so much for sharing that. So just double clicking on internal comms, because I think it's one of the biggest, I don't want to say challenges, but it's one of the biggest things on the top of the minds of leaders, not just today, but like you said, Mike, it's kind of the internal is the new external. So are there any best practices that you both could share with our audience today? And how should leaders think about internal comms? And particularly now when we're facing this unprecedented crisis, should they increase the frequency of communications? Or should they, how can they best effectively communicate, virtually? We'd love to hear from maybe Mike, you can start with that.
Yeah, why don't I tee it up and then give it to Miguel. For almost 20 years, the founders at Google met on TGIF, and it's changed recently over the last year, but it used to be every Friday, and then it was every Thursday, and anyone in the company could ask any question. And I used to joke to my kids, if I came home late, they'd say, why are you late, Dad? And I said, I was producing an internationally broadcast variety show that we do with some really demanding talent. I mean, we broadcasted internationally for almost 20 years. And Larry and Sergey showed up, and Eric showed up, and Sundar showed up, and anyone who had any question that needed to be addressed showed up. And it was really extraordinary. I mean, it wasn't a week, a month, a year. It was like almost 20 years. So that level of commitment to something, and it was internal only. I mean, some of the stuff leaked at the end, but a lot of what happened was people just going to an open microphone and asking any question, and all of that was broadcast internationally. Really, just an extraordinary commitment to making sure that there was a voice, that they would listen. And one other thing, just quickly, it occurred to me, there was this thing inside of Google called Meme Gen. It still exists, and you'd create memes and you'd post them, and then employees would vote up and down on them, and you could see the trend analysis of, is a question getting more positive memes or more negative memes, and people would watch it, and everyone would be on their phone watching these meme gens and laughing about what was being said and how it was said. And that became a very important, very informal signal of the sentiment inside of the company, even at scale. So it started as just like these little comics that would go, and it became really a trend analysis on the sentiment and well-being of employees. And those types of things, setting up those types of things, sometimes it's almost accidental that it has such a loud and profound impact on an organization. But I think it starts with consistency. It starts with having a commitment to do X at Y time at scale.
That's great, Miguel.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, in my own experience, I mean, I was, I worked for an organization that has the kind of unique privilege of being able to kind of think in kind of centuries, actually, or kind of decades in terms of how it kind of plans things. It probably rivals only the papacy for that. But it meant that in order to do that, we had to, I was lucky enough to be working for the young princes when they were in their early 20s and thinking about their lives ahead. And we were able to kind of think about how they communicate in a way that would allow them to be authentic. That was the most important thing. They had to be themselves. If you're going to be in public life for that long, you can't pretend to be someone you're not. You have to just have the chance to be yourself, really. And so we designed, helped them design their programs and their interests and so on around what best fitted their characters. And behind that is the same point about consistency. I mean, the Queen's kind of great kind of mantra, this is no kind of secret, is to see and be seen. That's how she's operated for 67 years, and has not changed her modus operandi at all in that time. It's an extraordinary example in what happens when you just stick to what you believe in, what you're good at. And that's what she has done. It's the kind of the role model that I know that the young generation of the royal family, particularly Prince William, are going to follow now. But I mean, when you kind of apply that into real life, when you apply that to kind of corporate life, it's the same things. Fall back on what you actually believe in as a company. I noticed actually in the earnings calls this week that BP and Shell did, that they both used quite a lot of their earnings call once they talked about COVID-19 and the kind of current crisis to talk about the future, to talk about sustainability and climate change. And I thought that was very smart. It was a really good way of signaling that, one, there is going to be a future. We're not just going to be in the current crisis that we're in at the moment. And when we are into that future, those core principles are still super important. And I know other companies are doing that now. I mean, just as one anecdote, I had an email pop into my inbox the day before yesterday from the CEO of JetBlue, the US airline. And, airlines are just going through the most, awful crisis. I mean, what's happening to them is genuinely unprecedented. And he, in his email, which is quite regular, he emails his customers quite regularly. I mean, he again acknowledged just how scared people, particularly internally, must be feeling, his staff and so on. But he used the email to extend an offer to healthcare heroes. I think it's something like every healthcare hero, everyone can nominate one healthcare hero to have a return flight. And I just thought that was, in a time like this, actually to fall back on a community value, something that you actually believe in, is really, I mean, it's great marketing, but it's also really courageous to do. And I mean, I will probably, help them in the long term. It's, so much better than the kind of the alternative of just kind of squabbling over kind of taxpayer money, which is what some other airlines are doing. So it's really tough, but having that kind of consistency, understanding who you are as a company and falling back on that is probably the only thing you can do right now.
That's really interesting. One thing I want to get to, because unfortunately quite a few companies have had to face this, is this kind of tough topic of layoffs. I know that several companies in the past couple of months have had to either let people go or furlough people, and Airbnb is the most recent example. So I'll be curious, about your thoughts, like from a communication perspective, what could we learn from what they did? And also any advice for companies that are having to go through layoffs or furloughs right now, or will have to do so in the future? And I would love to hear both like external and internal perspective.
Miguel?
Yeah, I mean, you know, every company is having to kind of face the, every company is having to kind of think the unthinkable. You know, even companies that were growing hugely kind of 2 months ago are now having to kind of pivot to thinking about beyond furloughing people, cutting large numbers of staff, and some companies have already done it. And I think where that happens, you've got to go through a kind of stage. The first thing you've got to do as a CEO is to acknowledge that that might happen, that, you know, there's going to be some really tough decisions. And when you do so, again, fall back on your company narrative, fall back on why you're doing that. What are you trying to preserve that will still be there, you know, after this crisis? Empathy and compassion is super important. I mean, that goes without saying, although it's remarkable how often that is actually often overlooked. Because I think what companies often think about is they do that one-on-one with the people who are being let go, but they forget to kind of extend that to all the people that have been left behind, who are still, one, very scared that it might happen to them next, and two, just very upset for their colleagues. And then the other thing you've got to do is inject hope into the future. You've got to kind of still be able to kind of point to a confidence that you have that you're going to come out of this, and getting that balance right in a message is tough, but CEOs can do it. And I think they do it when they fall back on their authenticity. They fall back on themselves and the pain that it's caused them, the unexpectedness of the decision and so on. And the CEOs that you end up trusting when you see, you know, you watch lots of announcements, are those CEOs who are doing that. The ones who do it robotically, or worse, don't even front it up themselves and let, you know, somebody else, chief people officer or someone else do that. That's where you just kind of sense that you just don't, that's when I think it's really hard to kind of to have trust in a company, which is a kind of core underpinning of what companies need right now if they're going to come through this intact on the other side. I don't know, Mike, you've probably got, I mean, I know we were lucky enough in the royal household never to have gone through something like this, so I've never had to experience it firsthand, but I can certainly advise lots of people who have.
Yeah, and it's, I think you have a lot of experience on that. At Google, it didn't happen that often. I remember before Google, I was working at a startup, and it was the moment where I decided to leave. And I was talking to a reporter. I was under my cube with my finger in one ear and the phone held to the other, talking to a reporter, telling them things were going to be okay. And I did think that they actually were going to be okay at the startup. And it was before the first downturn. Well, people outside of my cube were crying. And I went home and I was just like, I can't do this anymore. And I left. I think that one of the things that often gets overlooked in this, and it's difficult, right? It's awful, right? My dad used to say, quote my dad again, business is personal, it always was, and it always will be. I mean, these are very personal decisions, and there's no way to separate that, in my opinion. And I think one of the things that gets lost in it is the people who are left behind, right? The people who stay in the company. You still need to go on. And it's after you've gone through this awful thing that is really, really hard, there's another thing that you need to do to signal that they might be thinking, well, am I next? What does this mean for benefits? What does it mean for cost? What does it mean for fundraising? All this. So it's a continuum. It's not a moment. And thinking of it as such, I think helps a little bit, but I go back to tone matters, absolutely. And sometimes it just means listening, and over communication means sometimes just making yourself available and hearing how people feel and acknowledging that. So, but there's no denying, it is a tough thing to do. It's probably the toughest in my opinion.
Yeah, I just found particularly upsetting and sad because I know so many of our companies, they put so much effort into recruiting amazing talent, and it's gotta be so incredibly hard to lose that talent in such a, you know, given the tough conditions that we're facing right now. So we're getting quite a few questions from the audience. So I just maybe shifting gears quickly to address some of them. So maybe Miguel, this is a question for you. What are the main lessons you learned while working with the royal family? that have helped you advise clients at Milltown. Are there any universal communication best practices you find yourself telling leaders most often that you can share?
Yeah, sure. I've kind of talked about them, a couple of them already. I mean, one is consistency. You know, knowing what you're about as a company, knowing what you're about as an organization. In the royal family, we used to spend a lot of time thinking about the values that we stood for, and why the royal family has endured as such a kind of popular institution for so long. I mean, it is, just as an aside, it was absolutely remarkable that we didn't, as an institution, we never polled, but other people did. And since polling began in the 1960s on sentiment towards the royal family in Britain, I mean, it essentially didn't change at all. It kind of moved within a small kind of error of about 5%, but stayed around kind of the mid 70s, with only a very small, around kind of 13 to 18% that were kind of universally opposed. And if you think of the social changes that have happened in those 60 years, how many kind of radical young generation of people have come up through the generations, and then come to really appreciate the royal family. And you think about why that is. It's because the royal family have been very true to themselves. They have been very true to sticking by their core values and not trying to kind of extend beyond that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that point about accessibility. I mean, that sounds like a perverse thing to say when you're talking about a royal family that lives in castles and palaces, but we used to spend a lot of time thinking about that in a way that was authentic and didn't look kind of cheesy and too celeb-y. And that meant, making sure that royal family spent a lot of time with members of the public. When I left the royal household, I went to do a short thing back at university, where I studied inequality in the UK. And my lens for that was, I was lucky enough when I was working with the royal family, privileged enough to get out to communities in the UK that even politicians very seldom visit. But it was our job to do that. It was our job to make sure that we got out there and met people and understood people, and that communication wasn't just done remotely. It was kind of done in person, in face to face. And the royal family, again, has been really true to that. I mean, if you think about what the royal family does now, it does much more on social media than it did before, before it could do. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's essentially kind of standing for timeless values and communicating with people where they are. I mean, it's something that was a point that kind of Mike made earlier. Meeting people where they are is kind of super important. And that means celebrating success. It means also being with people when they're in mourning and going through a very tough time. So they're probably the two main principles. And I suppose there's a few others, which is always do the right thing. If you've, I worked for Prince Harry, who is a wonderful, wonderful character. But, he's he got himself into scrapes when he was younger. And when he did get himself into those scrapes, he would always say, I need to apologize straight away. I need to say sorry, and I need to look like I mean it. And then it was our job as communications people to find the right kind of channels to do that on his behalf. But I think that's super important. If you're in this for the long game, don't blame other people for what you're going through. Take responsibility yourself, be accountable, and own up, acknowledge. The point about Zoom that Mike made earlier, I mean, one of the things that I really take my hat off to them is the fact that, above all, they've just acknowledged that this has been really tough and unexpected, and they're having to learn on the job, and they're kind of asking people's patience with them as they're developing these new products and securities and so on. And people will give, you will give companies the benefit of the doubt if they are kind of honest about that, if they are honest about where they are right now. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, I mean, it was, thank you for sharing that. So kind of a segue into our next question. Miguel, you were kind of touching about on this a little bit, but we have two questions around like the external environment, the media, and maybe Mike, you could take this, but so the question is, there's two questions that maybe we can lump together. So one is, can you expand on what best practices are for working with media during these times? And then kind of the second part of this question is, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen people or companies make when dealing with the media during a crisis?
Okay. Wow, it's a big question. So the meteors in business, right? They have a business and they have customers, and those customers are usually readers or viewers or whatnot, and they want to satiate those. So I think understanding that in the first place is a huge gain. The second is invest in relationships. Relationships matter. You know, it's so to this day, I'm friends with people who covered us, and some of those people who covered Google at that time were pretty difficult, but we became friends, maybe loose friends, but I had an awful lot of respect for their opinion, and often we would argue very, very zealously around it. So get to know the people who are covering your business at a very personal level and get to understand their point of view. I think that that is just a good business practice in general. The other thing I'd say is that, again, tone matters. And what Miguel had said about the royal family, when you've made a mistake, say it. And be earnest in it. But if you haven't made a mistake, there are times that it is fair to push back, and to push back very, very hard. I'd be cautious around that, but I think back, I was at Google when Snowden said we had a backdoor into our data centers and that the NSA had access to information. And it was just one of those, just take a deep breath, like, oh my God, moments. And did the diligence, and some very, very technical people did the diligence, and this is just flat out not true. And we're going to say flat out, this is not true. So those moments of when you make a mistake, be earnest about it. When it is one of those moments where it is not true, it's okay to push back. Try not to be just overly austere, but relationships matter. Business is personal, and the people that are covering your business or have an invested interest in that business, get to know them a little bit. They probably have some pretty interesting things to say.
I find that as a communication professional, that's probably the hardest thing to do, because the instinct is to hold information back and protect. Where actually I've also noticed that being honest and being truthful actually does go a long way.
Yeah, I love a good argument, honest to God. And some of the best arguments I had in my tenure at Google were inside Google with people. And you know, shouting might be a little bit much, but it was certainly loud. And I like having different opinions on things. I think that that's healthy. When I'm on a plane and I sit next to someone who has very, very different political opinions from me, I think of it as a gift. Or when I did sit on a plane. So I think that that's this notion of there are boundaries and get to know some people. I mean, be cautious around it because they're going to report on it. But I think that they're in business with their customers, and having a sensitivity to that will gain you a lot of traction.
Yeah. This is a follow-on question. And actually, this is an interesting one because we get it quite a bit from our portfolio companies. So love both of your opinion on this. But obviously, we're in a very tough environment. So as I mentioned earlier, you're facing a crisis communication even when you're doing well, because you have to communicate positive news in a very thoughtful, human way. So what are some core principles you stick to as companies consider announcing positive non-COVID news, such as new product or new, leadership changes and so forth? Any thoughts from both of you on this? And just as a kind of doubling down on this, anything on shifting play strategy, tone, and tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that actually Satya Nadella in the last few days on his social has started to kind of talk about more kind of business as usual type issues, awards, sustainability, new appointments and so on, which is quite an interesting shift actually. And you can kind of see other CEOs doing the same. And people are doing so kind of tentatively. I mean, the crisis is still very real for all of kind of Microsoft's employees, and I'm sure Satya's really kind of aware of that. But you also need to inject some business as usual and some normality into what's going on, and you can't kind of remain in kind of flight or fight mode forever. And so I see this as a good thing, that companies are beginning to think about that. I think it's to do with also broadening out. We talked about the importance of leaders being present and having a kind of regular cadence of communication, but it's also about broadening out to other leaders who have other things to say. businesses, kind of other departments are still continuing, products are still being unveiled, and so on. And those C-suite executives still have a point of view and something to say. And I think if you're willing to kind of let other people speak and still kind of overall control the narrative, then I think you can do that. But it's a difficult pivot, and you've got to kind of stay aware of, whilst things are getting better, they could go backwards, and just have a plan for when they do. But I see it as a positive thing that leaders are beginning to think about the future, and to kind of talk about things in a bit more of a normal way.
Yeah, I agree.
We have a couple more, just a quick time check. We have a couple more questions. Could you both stay on for maybe 5 more minutes to?
Yeah,
sure.
Okay,
I might have a dog that interrupts me, but yeah, I'm okay.
Dogs and babies are the norm nowadays. So, I mean, if you don't,
oh,
Jeremy thought I was done. All right.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Mike, did you have any perspective on that question? Because I think it's kind of an important and interesting one.
Oh, no, I mean, we're in a liminal moment. I don't think but I do agree that the narrative is shifting right now. It's Stephen Levy interviewed Larry Brilliant in March, and he's the guy who started Google.org and helped eradicate smallpox. And it was one of the most popular stories in the history of Wired. And that seemed to be like a peak. And now the story is, when are we going to emerge? How are we going to emerge? What is it going to be? And I think companies having good news is fine. Focusing on products is absolutely the right thing. You're in business to be in business. I'd say just be humble around it, or matter of fact around it. It's not a moment to brag. But if it is, if you are seeing success on it, be straightforward. Just dose of humility, I think, is a good one right now.
So Mike, this is a follow-on question to you, and I know that at one point you were a journalist. So we have a question around the media. What do you think the consequences will be for traditional media from the lockdown? Every journalist I speak to says readership is through the roof, but half of my colleagues are being furloughed or laid off. Do you think any of these shifts will be permanent?
I think who I wish I knew. I think, yeah, some of them are going to be permanent. I think that the readership is through journalism is in business to make money too. I still think of myself as a journalist to some degree, and they need to monetize. I mean, I get hit with paywalls all the time, and I try to go through those paywalls and register. And I think that subscribing to some things, honestly, I still subscribe to some paper publications, subscribe online. I mean, they need to make money too. So I think that's one, that's all of us can do that, and all of that will help. But I do think some of this distributed workplace environment will change, and the newsroom will change. Unfortunately, I'm seeing some layoffs in the media as well. So I think that they're not immune. They will be affected. The distributed workplace and the individual reporting, the reporter as kind of not a celebrity, but as an icon, I think that's a movement that won't change very much.
Miguel, the next question is to you, and I'm really glad people brought this up, but social media, I mean, you mentioned that earlier, even the royal family is increasingly using it. So do you, or if Mike, have thoughts on the role of different platforms for different communication tactics? When should you use a blog, a video, social? Anyway, so Miguel, maybe take this on, and Mike can follow.
It's a really good question, actually. What's interesting is that early on in the crisis, I noticed that a lot of CEOs were using very kind of long form communications, video messages, long blogs, and so on. And now, as we're getting into more of a business as usual, or beginning to creep into that, those same CEOs are now kind of reverting to shorter form messages, tweets, Instagram, photo pieces, and so on, short text pieces. And I think that kind of reflects a reality that at the beginning of a crisis, in order to demonstrate empathy and demonstrate vulnerability and humility, you've got to show yourself. I mean, there was a wonderful video that the CEO of Marriott did in a very kind of humble man, who right at the beginning of the crisis, and I'd encourage people to look it up, did a video where he just spoke to his customers and to his staff and said, I know you're really scared, I am too. And this is what we're doing about it, and this is how I'm feeling about it. And it kind of set the scene for presumably some very, very difficult decisions that Marriott are now having to make. In terms of kind of which social media platforms to use, I mean, I would fall back on the rule that the CEO of Walmart uses when he kind of posts regularly on his personal Facebook profile, which has an enormous following, because that's where a lot of his staff follow him and see him. That's the only accessibility most people have towards him. And he does that. That's because that's where the audience that he wants to speak to are. You know, there are other more kind of, as it was, sophisticated platforms that he might be able to use to talk to audiences, but he's chosen that one because that's where people he wants to talk to are. And I think you have to do your homework. You know where your audiences are, what are they using, what are they following, who are they following, and be part of that conversation and be present there. There's no point trying to impose your own kind of view of what you think it should be. You just have to kind of be where people actually are.
I'd like to tap into that last phrase that you used around conversations. When I first came to Silicon Valley, my boss was this guy named Doc Searles, and he came up with this phrase that just blew my mind at the time: markets are conversations. And when you think about that, I mean, from the very earliest markets, I mean, Wall Street was a particular tree where people met, and it just happened to be on Wall Street. And so our largest markets are around a place where people met. Companies need to have dialogues, not monologues. And I think that the default is I'm going to write a long blog post and the world's going to understand me, because they don't understand. Rachel Whetstone, my boss at Google, used to say, no one, she was British, no one cares how the sausage is made, you know? And so the notion of, I'm just going to explain myself and people will get it. I'd say use that sparingly, the long form blog, and instead engage, find opportunities to have a dialogue and talk to people around it. The social media platforms are great for that type of thing. It's more two-way and not one-way.
Okay, one last question, then I'll let you go. And this is a reward for people that stuck with the webinar through the end. So, I mean, you both had incredible employers, right? The royal family and Google. I think we would love to if each one of you shared a little secret with the audience on the call today. Anything that's not known publicly.
Miguel, you get to go first.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that.
I'm so curious if Megan and Harry are going to make it in the US personally, but
yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, they've that's been a kind of a really tough time for the whole royal family. Now, I don't work there, so I'm not kind of privy to how the royal family responded to it, but I do know how they think about things, and I've been really impressed actually with the way that the royal family has responded to the Harry and Meghan issue. You know, they have, I know how they've responded internally as well, but externally they have responded with compassion and humanity. And they've also responded swiftly to try and kind of help make decisions quickly for a couple who are really feeling the pressure. And it's, you know, for those of us who worked with them for a long time, we get it. You know, we totally understand why that pressure is immense. I mean, I think it creates a lot of additional pressure now for William and Kate, you know, on whom that burden is now kind of alone for the future. But I do get where kind of Harry and Meghan are, and I also kind of respect that the royal family has responded kind of so swiftly to it. In what must have been an incredibly difficult thing. But one crucial thing there, and actually Mike just put his finger on it, they haven't aired the dirty linen in public. You know, there hasn't been a kind of, there's lots of speculation about fallings out, which I happen to know aren't true, actually, I'm happy to say. And they haven't, but, you know, they haven't tried to kind of enter that kind of Kardashian style space of kind of he said, she said, and so on. And I'm kind of very proud to see that during this crisis, they have kind of stuck to their guns, stuck to their kind of time-honored communications principles, and it will work. It will kind of hold them for the long term.
There you have it. All this speculation is actually false.
Yeah, I'm happy to say. I mean, you know, the bonds of those two brothers go incredibly deep, and that's going to stay true for the rest of their lives. I'm pleased to say.
Mike,
you know, Miguel, thanks for taking that. So it gave me time to think. Actually, I kind of pointed to you, so I owe you one. I don't think there are any more secrets around Google. It seems like everyone that left Google wrote a book. You know, even my former boss, Jessica Powell, wrote a book, that The Big Disruption. It was fictional, and I was writing down, trying to remember, entirely fictional, but essentially true. It seemed everyone went on news shows or wrote blogs or books or whatnot. I will say this, and it is kind of an upbeat thing, and it's not like a deep, dark secret, but it's true that I traveled a lot with, mostly in Asia, but here too, with the leaders of the company and the founders of the company from time to time. And whenever they went to any office, they went dramatically out of their way, often at length, to talk to employees. And that was true wherever they were. And Sundar Pichai does it now. And it really is that commitment internally too. I know a lot has been reported around all of the internal churn around Google, and I saw some more reports around it today and their benefits and all the rest. But that commitment to it and that open culture and letting anyone, it's not for show. So that's not really gossipy, but if you want some gossip, just pick up one of those books.
You said gossip. I was trying to stay clear from that word, but thank you both so much. Such a privilege to have you on our webinar today, and I really appreciate your time, and the audience sent me a couple of thank you notes. So, and that the content has been great. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Well,
and Miguel, happy birthday to your husband.
Thank you. Champagne now. Yeah.
Another Zoom call with
Yeah, another Zoom call. Yeah, another. See you later.
Thank you
all
so
right,
much.
you guys.
Bye.
Yeah, that was fun. See ya. Bye-bye.